saying that we're going to have to stay this way the whole summer. Okay, so
I'm not saying that. You're jumping to conclusions.
Welcome back to The Life with the Browns. Tonight's Sister Wives Tell-All isn't just another televised reunion of familiar faces and rehearsed answers. It's the moment the carefully maintained illusion starts to crack under the weight of a single question. A question that sounds simple on the surface, but carries years of tension beneath it. As Sukanya Krishnan sits across from Meri Brown and her closest confidant Jen Sullivan, the conversation turns towards something the audience has whispered about for seasons, but never heard directly acknowledged on camera. Is Robyn submissive? It's a question that lands quietly in the room, but its impact is immediate. Jen doesn't flinch, doesn't hesitate, doesn't soften the edges of her answer. She simply says it, yes. And then she adds something even more revealing, and that dynamic works for Cody. 5 words that don't just describe a personality trait, they expose a system. Because in that moment, this isn't about Robyn's personality, her softness, or how she presents herself. It becomes about structure, power, influence, and how those things have quietly flowed through this family for over a decade, while everyone argued about everything except the real mechanism underneath it all. What makes the moment explosive isn't just Jen's answer, it's the reaction it triggers. In a separate clip, Cody's response is immediate and visibly angry. There is no calm correction, no attempt to reframe, no measured explanation of why the label is unfair. Instead, there is frustration, deflection, and rage directed at the person who said it. That reaction matters more than any denial could because it reveals something deeper than disagreement. It reveals discomfort with being seen too clearly. This is not about whether Robyn is quiet or assertive, dominant or passive. It's about what the perception of her submission has done inside the family system. Because for years, Robyn has been framed as the shy, pretty, submissive wife, a description Cody himself has repeated in various forms, intentionally or not reinforcing an image that sets her apart from the other wives. And once that image is established, everything that follows becomes easier to justify: attention, protection, priority, resources. Not because she demanded them openly, but because she fit the role that made receiving them feel natural, even inevitable. To understand why Jen's comment cuts so deep, you have to understand what submissive has come to mean in this context. It's not simply about obedience or silence. It becomes a performance, a way of existing that signals ease, non-demand, and emotional safety. And in a household built on competing emotional needs, that performance changes everything. The wife who appears not to demand often becomes the wife who receives the most. Not through confrontation, but through contrast. While others express frustration, ask for fairness, or voice emotional injury, the submissive presence appears peaceful by comparison. And peace, in a chaotic emotional system, gets rewarded. Attention flows toward it. Protection gathers around it. Decisions start bending in its direction without ever needing to be explicitly requested. That's where the tension begins to form. Because while Robyn is perceived as submissive, the outcomes around her tell a more complicated story. Over the years, she transitions from financial instability into security, from uncertainty into a multi-million-dollar home environment, from being an outsider to becoming the central emotional and logistical priority in the family structure. And none of it is framed as ambition or demand. It is framed as care, as protection, as Cody simply choosing to provide. That distinction is everything. Because if it is his choice, then no one can call it inequality. If it is her request, then it becomes favoritism. But if it is simply what naturally happens, then accountability disappears into perception. That is why Cody reacts so strongly when Jen names it directly. Because naming something removes its invisibility. And invisibility is what has allowed this dynamic to function for so long without collapse. As long as Robyn is seen as simply soft, simply submissive, simply different, then every advantage she receives can be rationalized. But if that submission is not just personality, but strategy, or at the very least functionally beneficial within the system, then the entire narrative shifts. It raises questions that cannot be easily answered. Who is actually influencing decisions? Who is shaping outcomes without appearing to? And why did the same system produce very different realities for each wife depending on how they engaged with it? Meri experienced the system as obligation. Janelle experienced it as independence without reward. Christine experienced it as emotional neglect that eventually became unbearable. Each of them operated with clarity, directness, and expectation of fairness. And each of them ultimately found themselves outside the center of power. Meanwhile, the wife perceived as least demanding becomes the most protected. That contrast is not subtle anymore, it is structural. And when Jen says it out loud, she is not just describing Robyn. She is describing how the system responds to certain behaviors and not others. Kody's anger, then, is not just personal offense. It is disruption. Because if submission is acknowledged as something that produces advantage within the system, then it stops being passive. It becomes visible influence. And visible influence forces accountability. It means decisions were not just emotional, they were directional. It means preference may have been shaped. It means leadership may not have been as unilateral as it appeared. And that possibility is what destabilizes everything Cody has constructed around his role as the decision-maker, the provider, the one in control. This is why the tell-all moment feels different. Because it is no longer just about recounting past conflict, it is about interpreting it differently. The same events are being re-examined through a new lens. And once that lens is introduced, it cannot be removed. Every interaction between Cody and Robyn starts to look different. Every act of protection becomes questionable. Every moment of softness becomes strategic in hindsight. And whether that interpretation is fully accurate or not becomes almost secondary to the fact that it now exists in the collective understanding of the audience. And that is where tonight's tension truly lies, not in what is said, but in what is revealed by what is said. What makes this moment even more explosive is the way the entire structure of the Brown family has always depended on unspoken agreements rather than spoken truths. For years, conflict was managed not by confrontation, but by avoidance, soft language, and carefully chosen explanations that kept the surface calm even when the foundation was shifting underneath. Each wife learned, in her own way, how to survive inside that system. Meri learned to hold on through loyalty even when she felt increasingly isolated, convincing herself that patience would eventually be rewarded with stability and recognition. Janelle learned to detach emotionally and focus on practicality, believing that contribution and independence would eventually translate into fairness. Christine learned to speak up, to name her pain directly, and eventually to walk away when silence stopped being an option. But none of those strategies operated in the same way as what Jen is now indirectly pointing to in Robyn's case. Because if Robyn's role has been perceived as submissive, then the expectation was that she existed outside of conflict, outside of demand, outside of competition. And that perception created a psychological shield around her position in the family. It made it difficult for anyone to challenge outcomes without appearing harsh, jealous, or unreasonable. Because how do you criticize someone who is framed as simply gentle, simply emotional, simply not asking for much? That framing becomes powerful precisely because it removes accountability from the visible equation. And in that space, decisions begin to look organic rather than directed, natural rather than influenced, chosen rather than shaped. This is where the tension in Jen's statement truly begins to expand beyond personality and into structure, because she is not just describing how Robyn behaves. She is indirectly highlighting how behavior gets translated into advantage inside this family system. And once that translation becomes visible, it changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The audience starts re-evaluating years of moments that once looked like coincidence or preference and begins to see patterns of alignment, who benefited when decisions were made, who consistently ended up protected, and who repeatedly adjusted their expectations downward in order to keep peace. Even Kody's emotional reaction starts to take on a different tone in this light, because anger often appears most intense when someone feels a narrative slipping out of their control. Not necessarily because the statement is false, but because it removes the comfort of interpretation. As long as Robyn is simply submissive, the story remains simple. Cody leads, Robyn follows, and everything else is just misunderstanding from the outside. But the moment that label is questioned as functional rather than passive, the simplicity collapses. Suddenly, leadership looks less absolute. Influence becomes harder to locate, and responsibility becomes distributed in ways that are uncomfortable to acknowledge. That is why this isn't just a disagreement in a tell-all interview, it is a fracture in the storytelling itself. Because the Brown family narrative has always relied on clear roles to explain unequal outcomes, but Jen's comment quietly dissolves those boundaries. It suggests that roles were not as fixed as they appeared, that behaviors carried strategic weight, and that what looked like emotional temperament may have functioned as leverage within a deeply imbalanced system. And once that possibility enters the conversation, every past justification starts to feel less like explanation and more like framing. The deeper this conversation goes, the more the focus shifts away from individual personalities and moves toward the invisible architecture that has been holding the entire family together and quietly pulling it apart at the same time. Because what Jen's comment does, whether intentionally or not, is force the audience to reconsider not just Robyn's role, but the way power itself has been distributed and disguised inside the Brown household. For years, the story was presented in relatively simple emotional terms. Cody loves Robyn more, the other wives feel hurt, and everyone struggles to adjust to an evolving family structure. But that version of events only works if influence is assumed to be direct, obvious, and equally visible to everyone involved. What this moment exposes is something more complicated, that influence in this system may have operated indirectly, through emotional positioning rather than formal authority, through perceived need rather than declared demand. This is where the idea of submission becomes so loaded, because in most traditional interpretations it suggests passivity, a lack of agency, someone who simply follows rather than directs. But inside a high-conflict, emotionally layered family system like this, submission can also function as a form of relational positioning. Not because it is inherently manipulative in every case, but because it changes how other people respond. When one person is perceived as low demand, emotionally soft, and non-confrontational, they often become the recipient of decisions designed to protect peace rather than distribute fairness. And over time, those peace-preserving decisions accumulate into structural advantage. Not through loud requests, but through quiet prioritization. That is why the reactions from Meri, Janelle, and Christine have always carried such emotional weight. Each of them, in different ways, operated from a place of clarity and expressed need. Meri sought emotional security and recognition of her foundational role, but increasingly felt sidelined as the family expanded. Janelle prioritized practicality and contribution, expecting that effort and financial input would translate into equitable treatment, only to find herself repeatedly deprioritized in emotional and relational terms. Christine voiced dissatisfaction more directly than anyone, openly naming imbalance and emotional neglect, and ultimately reached the point where leaving became the only way to reclaim self-respect. None of these approaches were submissive, yet none of them produced sustained access to the center of attention or resources within the family structure. Against that backdrop, Robyn's perceived submission takes on a different interpretive weight. Because if she was consistently seen as less demanding, more emotionally fragile, or more deferential, then the system would naturally begin to organize itself around her stability. Not necessarily because she asked for it explicitly, but because the system's priority became preserving harmony where it seemed most delicate. And in that environment, the person perceived as most emotionally central often becomes the person around whom decisions quietly crystallize. This is where the audience begins to question whether outcomes were driven purely by preference or whether emotional perception itself became a kind of currency inside the family. Cody's anger in response to Jen's observation therefore becomes more than just defensive television drama, it becomes a reaction to interpretation. Because interpretation changes meaning, and meaning changes accountability. As long as everything is framed as simple preference, then responsibility is clear and contained. Cody chose Robyn, and the others were simply not chosen in the same way. But if the dynamic is reframed as emotionally structured influence, where behavior, perception, and relational positioning shaped outcomes, then the narrative becomes far less comfortable. It raises questions about how decisions were formed, whose emotional needs were prioritized, and whether choice was ever as independent as it appeared. And that is why this moment resonates so strongly beyond the show itself. Because it is no longer just about who said what in a tell-all interview. It is about the collapse of a simplified story that once made sense of a very complex emotional system. Once that simplicity breaks, every past moment becomes open to reinterpretation, and nothing inside the history of this family looks quite as fixed as it once did. What makes this breakdown even more significant is how it forces the audience to re-examine not just the relationships, but the entire logic the Brown family used to justify its own structure for so many years. Polygamy, as it was presented on screen, was always framed as a spiritual system built on balance, fairness, and shared responsibility. The idea was that love would be multiplied rather than divided, and that each wife would occupy a distinct but equally valued place within a larger family unit. But what Jen's comment indirectly exposes is that equality inside that structure was never just about intention. It was about interpretation, perception, and emotional influence. Because in a system where one partner becomes the emotional center, equality stops being mathematical and starts becoming relational. This is where the idea of submission becomes even more complicated. On the surface, submission suggests a lowering of voice, a softening of presence, a willingness to defer. But inside emotionally charged systems, submission can also be interpreted as non-disruption. The person who does not create conflict, who does not openly challenge decisions, who does not escalate emotional tension, becomes easier to accommodate in the short term. And over time, ease begins to resemble priority. Not because it is formally declared, but because it requires less emotional management. Meanwhile, the voices that demand clarity, fairness, or direct accountability are often experienced as pressure, even when those demands are rooted in basic expectations of equity. That contrast becomes essential when looking at how each wife's role evolved over time. Meri's insistence on emotional acknowledgement and her desire for reaffirmed connection often placed her in positions of waiting for responses, waiting for clarity, waiting for consistency that rarely arrived in the way she needed. Janelle's grounded independence and practical approach meant she contributed heavily to the family system without always insisting on emotional reciprocity in real time, which eventually left her with fewer visible emotional returns despite significant investment. Christine, perhaps most visibly, named imbalance directly and repeatedly, refusing to normalize what she experienced as neglect, and ultimately exited when silence became more costly than truth. Against that backdrop, Robyn's perceived submissiveness takes on a different structural meaning. If she was consistently positioned or perceived as less confrontational, more emotionally sensitive, and more oriented toward harmony, then the system would naturally begin to route decisions around preserving that perceived stability. Not because she explicitly demanded advantage, but because the emotional cost of disrupting her perceived peace became higher than the cost of adjusting other people's expectations. In systems like this, the most protected position is often not the loudest or the most assertive. It is the one that appears most fragile to disrupt. This is where Jen's statement becomes more than just commentary. It becomes a reframing of cause and effect. Because once submission is interpreted not as absence of power, but as a relational position that shapes responses, the entire structure of decision-making inside the family becomes harder to view as neutral. Every major outcome, housing, attention, financial security, emotional prioritization, can no longer be explained purely through preference without also considering perception. And perception, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. The more Robyn is seen as low demand, the more decisions are made to keep her comfortable. The more decisions keep her comfortable, the more the perception of her as low demand is reinforced. Cody's reaction, then, becomes another layer of evidence in the audience's interpretation process. Because defensiveness often signals not just disagreement, but threat to identity. If the idea that Robyn's role has functionally shaped outcomes is accepted, then Cody is no longer just a decision-maker responding to love or preference. He becomes part of a system influenced by emotional positioning he may not fully acknowledge. That shift in framing is uncomfortable because it complicates the story of control. It suggests that what looked like straightforward choices may have been shaped by emotional dynamics operating beneath awareness. And that is what makes this tell-all moment feel different from previous seasons. It is not just revisiting conflict, it is reinterpreting causality. It is asking whether the outcomes the audience has watched for years were the result of simple favoritism, or the result of a deeper emotional system where perception, behavior, and influence quietly determined who received what and why. Once that question is raised, it lingers over everything that came before it, changing not just how the story is told, but how it is understood. What this all ultimately reveals is that the Brown family was never just operating as a group of individuals making separate emotional choices. It was functioning as a constantly shifting system of reactions, adaptations, and unspoken negotiations. And in any system like that, the most important factor is not always who speaks the loudest or who makes the most demands, but who manages to stabilize the emotional environment around them. Because stability, in a high-conflict relational structure, becomes its own form of influence. The person who reduces tension, whether intentionally or simply by personality, often becomes the gravitational center around which decisions begin to orbit. That is why Jen's comment lands with such force. It doesn't just label Robyn, it reframes how stability itself may have been interpreted and rewarded inside the family. If someone is consistently perceived as calm, non-confrontational, or emotionally delicate, the system often begins to organize itself around preserving that state. Not necessarily because anyone consciously decides to prioritize them over others, but because disruption feels more costly than adjustment. And over time, those small adjustments accumulate into patterns that look, from the outside, like favoritism, but from the inside, feel like simple maintenance of peace. This is where the contrast between the wives becomes structurally important rather than just emotionally dramatic. Meri's experience was shaped by a desire for emotional clarity and recognition that was often delayed or inconsistent, leaving her in a cycle of hope and disappointment that slowly eroded trust. Janelle's strength and independence made her incredibly capable within the system, but also meant she rarely occupied a space of emotional urgency that demanded immediate response, which over time translated into being taken for granted rather than actively prioritized. Christine's experience was the most direct confrontation with imbalance. She named it, challenged it, and ultimately removed herself from it when she realized that her emotional needs were structurally secondary. In that environment, Robyn's perceived submission takes on a different kind of weight. If she was consistently framed as less demanding, more emotionally sensitive, and more oriented toward unity, then she naturally became the point around which emotional decisions were least likely to create immediate resistance. And in systems driven by emotional management, the path of least resistance often becomes the path of most reinforcement. Not because anyone explicitly declares it, but because every decision that avoids conflict strengthens the conditions that made that decision feel necessary in the first place. This is what makes Cody's reaction to Jen's statement so revealing. Because if Robyn's submission is only understood as personality, then there is nothing to defend beyond preference. But if it is understood as a dynamic that shapes outcomes, if it becomes something that has functioned within the system to guide attention, resources, and emotional focus, then it shifts from description to implication. It suggests that influence may not have been as one-directional as the narrative of leadership assumes. And that possibility disrupts the identity Cody has consistently presented, the decisive patriarch making choices based on love, fairness, and intention. Once that identity is challenged, everything becomes more complicated, because it means outcomes cannot be explained solely through declared preference. It means emotional responses inside the family were not just reactions, but inputs into a larger system of decision-making. It means that what looked like simple favoritism may have been shaped by a deeper responsiveness to emotional presentation, who appeared easiest to maintain peace with, and who required ongoing negotiation. And that is why this tell-all moment resonates beyond entertainment. It is not just exposing conflict, it is exposing structure. It is asking whether the family was ever operating under the ideals it claimed, or whether it was always governed by quieter forces, emotional manageability, perceived fragility, and the constant recalibration of who gets prioritized in order to keep the system from breaking apart completely. Once that possibility enters the conversation, it changes how everything else is viewed. Past decisions are no longer isolated events, they become part of a pattern. And patterns, once recognized, are very difficult to unsee. What starts to emerge, once all of this is laid out, is not just a story about one wife being favored over others, it's a story about how emotional systems reward certain behaviors and quietly disadvantage others over time. And in that sense, the Brown family stops looking like a simple relationship structure and starts looking like a living feedback loop where each reaction reinforces the next decision, and each decision reshapes what is considered normal inside the family. Because in any long-term relational system, especially one as emotionally complex as plural marriage, perception becomes just as important as intention. It doesn't matter only what someone wants, it matters how that want is expressed, how it is received, and what emotional cost it creates for the people around it. That is why Jen's statement about Robyn being submissive carries such weight. It isn't just a label, it is a description of how behavior is interpreted inside a system where emotional impact often overrides formal rules. And once interpretation becomes the driving force, outcomes begin to follow emotional ease rather than equal distribution. This is where the pattern across the three former wives becomes even more revealing. Meri's long history with Cody shows someone who consistently sought emotional clarity and validation, only to find herself increasingly isolated as communication broke down. Her attempts to reconnect or reestablish importance often came across within the system as emotional intensity, which in turn created distance rather than resolution. Janelle's experience highlights a different dynamic. Her strength, independence, and practical contribution made her essential in terms of function, but not always central in terms of emotional attention. She became the stable pillar that required less immediate emotional investment, which paradoxically meant she was less frequently prioritized in moments of relational decision-making. Christine's arc is perhaps the most direct emotional rejection of the system itself. She voiced imbalance openly, refused to normalize neglect, and ultimately exited when the emotional cost outweighed the benefit of staying. In contrast, Robyn's perceived submission created an entirely different relational response. If someone is consistently perceived as emotionally soft, non-confrontational, and easily affected by tension, the system naturally begins to organize itself around avoiding distress for that person. Not necessarily through conscious favoritism, but through constant micro-adjustments designed to preserve peace. Over time, those adjustments build into structural advantage, not because it was explicitly designed that way, but because emotional systems prioritize what feels easiest to maintain in the moment. And this is where Cody's defensive reaction becomes more than just a personal outburst. It becomes part of this same system being described. Because when Jen names the dynamic, she is not simply commenting on Robyn's personality, she is disrupting the idea that outcomes were purely the result of independent choices. If Robyn's perceived submission has influenced how decisions were made, then Cody is no longer the sole visible driver of those outcomes. Instead, he becomes part of a feedback loop where emotional responses, perceived needs, and relational positioning all interact to shape what ultimately happens. That kind of reframing is uncomfortable because it removes simplicity. It challenges the idea that love alone determined priority, or that decisions were made in a vacuum of personal preference. Instead, it suggests that emotional manageability may have played a far greater role than anyone explicitly acknowledged. Who seemed easiest to protect from distress? Who seemed most likely to destabilize if neglected? Who seemed most aligned with preserving a sense of harmony, even if that harmony came at the expense of equality? And once that lens is applied, it changes how the entire history of the family is interpreted. Moments that once looked like isolated choices begin to form a pattern of emotional responsiveness. And patterns, once visible, cannot be unseen. They begin to reshape how every past interaction is understood, until even silence starts to feel like part of the structure rather than the absence of it. What becomes increasingly clear at this point is that the real conflict in the Brown family was never just between individual people, it was between competing emotional realities that were never fully acknowledged at the same time. Each wife experienced the same system differently, and each interpretation felt completely valid from inside her own perspective. But because those perspectives were never fully reconciled, they gradually hardened into separate narratives about fairness, love, and betrayal. And over time, those narratives stopped overlapping in any meaningful way. This is why Jen's comment about Robyn being submissive hits such a nerve. Because it doesn't just describe Robyn, it collides with all the other narratives at once. For Meri, it reopens the question of why emotional loyalty never translated into security. For Janelle, it raises the uncomfortable contrast between contribution and reward. For Christine, it echoes the long-standing frustration of feeling emotionally sidelined despite being openly expressive about her needs. And for Cody, it challenges the foundational identity he has built around being the central decision-maker in a system that supposedly reflected his values and leadership. If Robyn is perceived as submissive, then the immediate assumption is that she is passive in the system. But what the outcomes suggest, whether intentionally or not, is that passivity, or the perception of it, can itself become structurally influential. Because systems that prioritize emotional stability will often unconsciously reward the person who appears least likely to disrupt it. That doesn't require explicit planning or hidden intent. It can emerge naturally through repeated decisions made to avoid conflict. But the result is the same. One person becomes increasingly central, not because they demanded more, but because the system kept adjusting around them. This is where the idea of working for Cody, as Jen puts it, becomes so significant. Because it suggests that the dynamic is not one-directional. It is not simply that Cody chooses Robyn and the others are excluded. It is that the nature of Robyn's perceived behavior creates a relational environment in which certain choices feel easier, safer, or more justified. And once decisions start being shaped by emotional ease rather than equal obligation, the structure begins to shift, even if no one explicitly acknowledges that shift in real time. Cody's reaction, then, is not just emotional defensiveness, it is resistance to reinterpretation. Because reinterpretation threatens the simplicity of his own role. As long as he is the clear authority making clear choices, then outcomes can be explained through preference and compatibility. But if emotional positioning is acknowledged as part of how decisions formed, then authority becomes less absolute. It becomes entangled with influence, perception, and response. And that makes the entire structure harder to defend in simple terms. Meanwhile, the other wives' experiences continue to highlight how differently the system responded depending on how each of them engaged with it. Direct communication was often met with emotional fatigue. Independence was often interpreted as reduced need. Emotional honesty was often reframed as conflict. And over time, those interpretations shaped outcomes in ways that were not always visible in the moment, but become much clearer in hindsight. And that is what makes this tell-all moment feel like a turning point rather than just another episode. Because it is not only revisiting old tensions, it is reorganizing how those tensions are understood. It is taking experiences that once felt scattered and placing them into a pattern that suggests emotional systems were operating underneath the surface all along, quietly guiding who was prioritized, who was reassured, and who was left to adjust. Once that pattern is seen, it cannot easily be unseen. It begins to reshape every memory, every decision, and every silence that once seemed insignificant. And in that reshaping, the story stops being about isolated conflict and becomes about structure, perception, and the hidden logic of emotional survival inside a fractured family system. What ultimately starts to surface beneath all these shifting interpretations is a much more uncomfortable realization. The Brown family's collapse wasn't sudden, it was cumulative. It didn't break because of one argument, one betrayal, or one moment of favoritism. It broke because years of small emotional adjustments slowly hardened into structural imbalance, and no one inside the system was fully able to correct it while it was happening. By the time it became visible, it had already been in place for years. This is why Jen's comment about Robyn being submissive feels so loaded. It is not simply a description of behavior, it becomes a lens through which the entire history of the family gets reevaluated. Because if submission is interpreted not as absence of influence, but as a relational posture that shapes how others respond, then it stops being passive. It becomes active within the system, even if unintentionally. And once something becomes active in shaping outcomes, it can no longer be dismissed as neutral personality difference. In that light, every wife's experience begins to look like a different interaction with the same underlying structure. Meri's experience becomes one of emotional persistence in a system that increasingly responded with distance rather than reassurance. Her attempts to maintain closeness often collided with a growing sense of invisibility, where effort did not reliably translate into emotional return. Janelle's experience reflects a different kind of imbalance, one where reliability and contribution were constant, but emotional acknowledgement remained inconsistent, creating a gap between what she gave and what she received. Christine's experience exposes the breaking point of that gap entirely, where emotional honesty, rather than producing change, instead clarified that the system was not adjusting in response to her needs. And then there is Robyn, whose perceived submission changes how the system reacts around her. If someone is consistently perceived as emotionally delicate, non-demanding, and sensitive to tension, then the system naturally begins to prioritize minimizing distress in their direction. Not necessarily through conscious favoritism, but through repeated decisions aimed at preserving calm. Over time, those decisions accumulate, and accumulation becomes structure. What begins as small emotional accommodations gradually turns into consistent prioritization, not because anyone declared it, but because the system kept choosing the path that felt least disruptive. This is the part that makes Cody's reaction so revealing. Because if Robyn's position is framed purely as passive submission, then there is nothing to interrogate beyond personality. But if that submission is understood as a functional element within a larger emotional system, something that shapes how decisions are made and justified, then the simplicity of choice begins to fracture. It suggests that decisions were not only based on preference, but also on emotional pressure, perceived fragility, and the desire to maintain equilibrium within a constantly sensitive environment. That shift in framing directly challenges the identity Cody has maintained for years. The identity of the decisive patriarch, making clear, independent choices rooted in love and fairness, becomes harder to sustain if emotional dynamics are acknowledged as part of the decision-making ecosystem. Because then choices are no longer isolated acts of will, they become responses within a system that reacts to behavior, perception, and emotional signals. And that is where the tension of this tell-all moment truly lives. It is not just about what is being said. It is about what becomes possible to see once it is said. Once the idea enters the conversation that submission, independence, emotional expression, and perceived need all interact to shape outcomes, then the entire history of the family becomes open to reinterpretation. Nothing looks singular anymore. Every outcome looks connected. Every decision looks influenced by more than just stated intention. And every role, no matter how simple it once seemed, starts to reveal layers of emotional function beneath it. At this stage, what the audience is really watching is not just a breakdown of a family, but the unraveling of a narrative that once made that family feel understandable. For years, the Brown family dynamic was packaged in a way that allowed viewers to sort people into clear emotional roles: the leader, the romantic favorite, the struggling wives, the one who stayed, the ones who left. That structure made the chaos feel organized. It gave meaning to imbalance by turning it into story logic. But now, that logic is starting to collapse under closer scrutiny. Jen's comment about Robyn being submissive acts like a crack in that structure. Because once you introduce the idea that behavior is not just personality, but also function within a system, everything becomes less stable. Submission is no longer just softness or compliance. It becomes something that interacts with power, perception, and decision-making. And once that interpretation is available, it begins to spread backward through the entire history of the family, recoloring moments that once seemed straightforward. Meri's experience, for example, starts to look less like simple rejection and more like prolonged emotional misalignment inside a system that no longer responded to her efforts in the way she expected. Her loyalty, which once felt like it should have guaranteed stability, instead existed in tension with a structure that was increasingly prioritizing emotional ease over emotional accountability. Janelle's practical, steady contribution begins to look like the backbone of a system that relied on her strength without necessarily centering her needs in return. And Christine's emotional clarity, her willingness to say out loud what others would not, becomes the clearest signal that the system was no longer adjusting in response to truth, but in response to comfort. Against that backdrop, Robyn's perceived submission takes on a different interpretive weight. If she is consistently seen as non-confrontational, emotionally sensitive, and oriented toward harmony, then the system naturally begins to treat her emotional state as something